Hello, everyone, and welcome to another lecture from International Reporting. I'm Professor Harper, and today I'm going to talk about immigration. There's a lot of bad information that's out there from both sides of the political spectrum, and what I'm going to do is kind of take us through the history of immigration in the United States, drill down into some of the data with respect to immigration, and then look at immigration patterns throughout the world. So if we look at the timeline of U.S. immigration, it was unrestricted for the most part at the beginning of the country in 1776. There were some changes in 1795, which limited to free white persons residing in the United States who renounce allegiance to their former country. Um, a restriction um, on blacks who were free, not slaves, and also to force people to renounce allegiance to the United Kingdom, to Britain. Another restriction, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were under the presidency of John Adams, and likely the reason why he was not denied why he was denied a second term. It was a very unpopular, aimed at his political opponents. The president was given the right to expel aliens deemed dangerous to the country. In the 1850s, again, other controls, the emergence of the Know Nothing Party, which sought to purify the nation by restricting immigration and altering citizenship requirements. This only lasted 10 years, but again, exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a fear of competition from Chinese workers, which led to the prevention of any further Chinese entering the United States. This was at a time of the building of trains throughout the United States. Large pockets of Chinese existed throughout the United States. In 1885, the contract labor laws prohibited contracts for cheap foreign labor, again, basically to restrict Chinese. As we move on, Ellis Island was set up in New York to regulate immigration in 1892. Further restrictions in 1917, the outbreak of World War I, that there were restrictions which expanded to classes of foreigners excluded from the United States. It imposed a literary test and designated an Asian barred zone. In 1921, the Congress of the United States established the first quota system for immigrants. In 1924, the National Origins Act reduced the quotas of immigrants deemed less desirable, such as Russian Jews and Italian Catholics. So you can see what's happening here is further restrictions. In 1942, there was an agreement with Mexico that guaranteed decent living conditions for Mexicans who came in to work on a temporary basis into the United States. 1948, the Displaced Persons Act of Immigrants from World War II actually allowed more Europeans come into the United States. The Immigration and Nationality Act was a consolidation of immigration laws and abolished the Asian barred zone. In 1953, there was the Refugee Relief Act, which again helped people come to the United States. So after World War II, we saw somewhat of an opening up of the United States. The early immigration was only about 6,000 people a year in the early days of the Republic. Some were the French refugees from a slave revolt in Haiti. After 1820, federal records were kept, and the largest groups to come in for quite a while were the Irish from the famine of 1845 to 1849, and also 500,000 Germans. 1850 was the first census to ask for a place of birth, and 90% of the population by that time was actually native born to the United States. Going into the rest of the timeline, again we see some expansion, but a lot of contradiction. So that in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the quota system, but it placed an annual limit on visas for immigrants. The Refugee Act increased overall refugee quotas, which tends to affect us today as people seek refugee status. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act granted lawful permanent residency to about 2.7 undocumented immigrants. This was under the Reagan administration, which allowed for people who were already here to get permanent residency, but placed significant restrictions for those people who would come in the future. In 1990, the Immigration Act established categories of employment and placed a cap on the number of non-immigrant workers. In 1992, there was the Chinese Student Protection Act. In 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act imposed strict penalties against illegal immigration and expanded the definition of reasons for being deported. So under the Clinton administration, you had some of the most restrictive immigrant laws on the books. So there are various categories. A citizen is sworn loyalty to a nation. Naturalization is a process by which citizenship is conferred. Usually there's a period of continuous residence and physical presence in the United States. You have to be resident in a particular district prior to filing. You need the ability to write, read, and speak English. A knowledge and understanding of U.S. history and government. Sometimes it's thought that most native-born citizens should take the test. It's quite difficult. You should be of good moral character, have an attachment to the principles of the U.S. Constitution, and a favorable disposition toward the United States. The other statuses that exist is a resident intending to stay, a guest worker, a foreign labor is hired on a permanent or temporary basis. Undocumented workers or citizens are those who lack permission to be here. An economic migrant, a guest worker or a foreign worker. A refugee seeking asylum to escape persecution outside of the United States. An illegal, prohibited by law or accepted rules. A resident alien, a foreign national living and working in the United States. In terms of the numbers and drilling down into the data, the United States has more immigrants than any other country in the world. So today there are more than 40 million people living in the U.S. who were born in another country, accounting for about 1/5 of all of the world's immigrants according to the data of 2017. The population of immigrants is also very diverse, with just about every country in the world being represented among the United States immigrants. In looking at this chart, the percentage of immigrants was relatively small, although it was 10% in 1850, and stayed relatively static up until the 1920s. And then the Immigration Act of 1924, we saw a significant decline of immigrants as things tightened up even more, so that it went down to approximately 5% in the 1970s. The Immigration Act of 1965, we actually saw an increase so that the percentage of the U.S. population is near a historic high at the current moment. So some of the trends that there's an unauthorized immigrants from Central America is one significant trend from the so-called Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. A trend that also displayed in rising apprehensions of people from those countries at the border. India and Venezuela also had increases in their U.S. populations of unauthorized immigrants over the past decade. In looking at the immigrant profile, so that unauthorized immigrants are almost a quarter of the U.S. foreign-born population. Lawful immigrants are a significant group of 35 million, or 77%, and then there are 12.3 million lawful permanent residents and temporary lawful residents of $2.2 million, so that 2.2 million people, so that out of the entire immigrant population, if you will, 23% are unauthorized immigrants, or 10.5 million people. In terms of the unauthorized immigrant totals and declines, and what's happened is that there's been some significant changes from 2007 to 2017. So as economic conditions got significantly better in Mexico, for example, the number of people who came here dropped by almost 2 million people over those 10 years. Central America is up 400,000. South America is down 130,000 people. The Caribbean is approximately the same. The large groups that have come in outside of Latin America and Central America, South America, Asia increased by 130,000. Europe and Canada down significantly, and the Middle East and Africa roughly the same. So over the 10-year period from 2007 to 2017, primarily because of the change in the decline of Mexicans coming into the United States unauthorized, the count has gone down from 12 million to 10.5 million. So a decline over the period from 2007 to 2017. Arrests along the border have actually gone down as of 2018. The higher numbers, if you look closely, the type's a little small, but in the 1990s and the mid-2000s, the arrests were in the neighborhood of 1.1 to 1.5 million people, so that now we're looking at about 400,000. So the number of arrests has actually declined significantly over time. But arrests are down, but the numbers seeking asylum have risen greatly. So the flow of migrant family has reached record levels. With February 2019, they were 560% above those for the same period in 2018, and as many as 27,000 children are expected to cross the border and enter the immigration enforcement system in the last figures of April 2019 alone. The immigration courts, as a result, there's a huge backlog. So if you look at the trend line, you can see from 2000 there were less than 200,000, and now we are up to almost 1 million people who are seeking some form of immigration status in the United States. Though many of the policies that aim to reduce unlawful immigration focused on enforcement at the border, individuals who arrive in the United States legally and overstay their visas are a significant portion of the undocumented population. So that a Center for Immigration Studies report found that in 2010 to 2017, individuals who overstayed their visas far outnumbered those who crossed the border illegally. In terms of legal immigration, the United States granted 1.1 million individuals legal permanent residency in 2017. More than 2/3 of them were admitted on the basis of family reunification. Others included employment, refugees, diversity, asylum seekers. But again, there were quite a few that are still waiting for immigrant visas. There are hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals who work legally in the United States under a variety of non-immigrant visas. In 2017, the United States granted close to 180,000 visas for high-skilled workers, known as H-1B visas, and more than 280,000 visas for temporary workers in agriculture and other industries. Immigrants make up roughly 17% of the U.S. workforce in 2014. Around 2/3 of those were in the country legally. Collectively, immigrants made up 45% of domestic employees. They also comprised large portions of the workforce in the U.S. textile manufacturing, agriculture, and accommodation, hotels and restaurants. Congress has debated numerous immigration reforms over the past 2 decades, some considered comprehensive, others piecemeal. Um, Comprehensive immigration reform refers to omnibus legislation that attempts to address the following issues: demand for high and low skilled labor, the legal status of millions of undocumented immigrants living in the country, border security, and interior enforcement. The last time that legislators came close to significant immigration reform was in 2013, when the Democrat-led Senate passed a comprehensive reform bill that would have provided a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and tough border restriction provisions. And the bill did not receive a vote in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. Today we have the reverse, so that the Republicans control the Senate and the Democrats control the House of Representatives, and so there has been a logjam there in terms of any type of comprehensive reform. The Obama administration took several actions to provide temporary legal relief to many undocumented immigrants. His administration began a program known as DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that offered renewable 2-year deportation deferrals and work permits to undocumented immigrants who had arrived in the United States as children and had no criminal records. Now, there were about 900,000 who had taken advantage of DACA, and so far it continues to exist, but there's no permanent status for the Dreamers. But on the other side, the Obama administration's enforcement practices drew criticism from the left and from the right, so that some immigrant advocacy groups criticized his administration for overseeing the deportation of more than 3 million people during his 8-year tenure, which was far more than the administrations of Bill Clinton and George Bush. So that Obama was kind of a double-edged sword. So on one hand, he helped with Dreamers legislation, but on the other, he had tough immigration policies. Trump has signed several executive orders affecting immigration policy. The first focused on border security and instructed federal agencies to construct a physical wall at the border with Mexico. That remains incomplete at this time. The second executive order, which focused on interior enforcement, expanded the categories of unauthorized immigrants and ordered increase in enforcement personnel. It also moved to restrict federal funds from so-called sanctuary jurisdictions, which limit their cooperation with federal immigration officials. The third one focused on terrorism prevention and banned nationals from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen for at least 90 days, and blocked nationals from Syria indefinitely and suspended the U.S. refugee program for 120 days. That goes in and out of force. It has to be a continuing resolution, and it has been so far, executive order that is, and still remains in effect. President Trump has more than halved the annual cap of refugees admitted to the United States to 50,000, and he has sought to make it more difficult for individuals to seek asylum, so that he ended the temporary protected status for thousands of Haitians and Nicaraguans who were allowed to remain in the country in the United States after environmental disasters, hurricanes and such, in their home countries. They were given up to 18 months, a period that can be extended, but in 2018, Trump ended the program for a variety of people who had been given access to the United States because of weather and disasters, etc., in their countries. President Trump also ratcheted up Obama's efforts to deter border crossings. In 2018, the Trump administration implemented what it called a zero tolerance policy, in which authorities arrested and prosecuted everyone caught crossing the southern border without authorization. And so it is somewhat interesting in that the actual number of people who are arrested has gone down significantly in the Trump administration in comparison with past administrations. There is a hard line that has been taken about people trying to cross through the physical border that exists with Mexico. The Democrats say that they would support the repeal of criminal penalties for migrants apprehended while crossing the border. Some have also expressed support for increasing aid to Central American countries and extending government health insurance plans to cover undocumented immigrants. State and local governments vary widely in how they treat unauthorized immigrants. California, for example, allows undocumented immigrants to apply for driver's licenses, receive in-state tuition at universities, and obtain other benefits. At the other end of the spectrum, states such as Arizona have passed laws permitting police to question people they suspect of being unauthorized immigrants. President Trump has been very adamant in his criticism of sanctuary jurisdiction. Philadelphia is one of those, and there have been a variety of challenges that are ongoing. In terms of the American attitude towards immigrants, it's changed in recent years, so that a recent survey found that about 6 in 10 American adults say that immigrants strengthen the country through their hard work and talents. On the other hand, about 1/4 say that immigrants are a burden to the United States by taking jobs, housing, and health care. The U.S. public's view of immigrants has largely reversed since the 1990s, when 63% said immigrants were a burden, and just about 1/3 said that immigrants strengthen the country. In terms of international immigration, if all of the world's international immigrants lived in a single country, it would be the world's 5th largest, with about 244 million people. Overall, international migrants make up about 3% of the world's population today. But they don't live in one country, but most of them live in middle to high income countries, so that the place where people leave to go to higher income places, number 1 is India, 15 million people. Mexico, 2nd. Russia, 3rd. China, 4th. And Bangladesh, 5th. So that's where they're coming from. Where are they going? The United States has more international immigrants than any other country. It's home to about 1 in 5 international migrants. Other top destinations include Germany, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom. As of 2015, nearly 3.5 million Indians lived in the United Arab Emirates, the world's 2nd largest migration corridor. Unlike the Mexico-US corridor, the numbers of Indians living in the UAE and other Persian Gulf countries has increased substantially during the past decade, from 2 million in 1990 to more than 8 million in 2015. Most have migrated for the economic opportunities in these oil-rich countries. The Middle East has the fastest growing migrant population. When counting both international migrants and displaced migrants within their own countries, such as Syria, the number of migrants in the Middle East doubled during the past decade, from 25 million in 2005 to 54 million in 2015, mainly as a result of civil war in Syria, the war in Iraq, and instability in the entire region. Just to get an idea of the definition of refugees. Refugees are persons who cross international borders to seek protection from persecution, war, and violence. Their total number has also increased from 50 years ago. So not including Palestinian refugees, there are about 1.7 million refugees worldwide as of 1960 and about 16 million in 2015. The number of refugees in 2015, however, is slightly less than in the early 1990s following the fall of the Berlin Wall. In terms of just showing it graphically, there was a huge increase in terms of refugees moving from the former Soviet Union to freedom in the West, and that's the highest number that we saw in the 1990s. But as civil wars, and economic disruption has occurred, we're now at a high level as well. In terms of Europe, Europe has also experienced its own refugee crisis, quote unquote, as a destination for Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, and others escaping violence in their countries, with nearly 1.3 million refugees applying for asylum in the European Union, Norway, and Switzerland in 2015. The European Union struck a deal with Turkey in March 2016 to limit migrants coming through that country. Although that deal has largely halted migration from Turkey to Greece, Italy is on track to receive a record number of refugees. The European Union continued to work through 1 million or more asylum applications and tens of thousands from unaccompanied minors. In terms of attitudes in Europe, there's the recent surge of refugees has come from Europeans are wary of immigrants in their countries. 8 of 10 European nations surveyed in the spring of 2019, half or more adults in those countries said that incoming refugees increased the likelihood of terrorism in their country. Half or more adults in 5 of the 10 countries said that refugees would have a negative economic impact on their countries, taking jobs and social benefits. I traveled to give lectures in Greece recently, and it was interesting because I found it unexpected, the antipathy in Greece toward people coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, so much so that they were being held in almost prison-like conditions away from the major capital cities. As the influx of different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities changed the face of Europe, few Europeans say that growing diversity makes their country a better place to live. In the 10 nations that were surveyed, the majority did not see increasing diversity as a positive influence. That's it for now. We'll see you online. Thanks very much.